Good afternoon, and welcome to Washington and Lee and to the opening event of our inaugural festivities. Today's panel on the liberal arts and the professions features four individuals with deep roots in liberal arts education and extraordinary professional accomplishments in a wide variety of fields. They will be led in conversation by our own Suzanne Keen, Dean of the College. My role is just to introduce the participants to you and get out of the way. Kelly Evans Chemi is a familiar face. Many of you remember Kelly from her time on campus, which was not very long ago. It's a little alarming, both in the classroom and on the lacrosse field, where she was an all-state attacker and team captain. And many of you have watched Kelly on CNBC, where she is co-anchor of Closing Bell each weekday afternoon. Kelly entered W&L thinking she might major in politics and also considered Romance languages, before a summer internship at Bank of America piqued her interest in seeing the world through the lens of financial markets. She majored in business journalism and notes her good fortune to have attended a liberal arts university where that is possible. I'm especially pleased to see a number of philosophy courses on her transcript, including one on Wittgenstein. Kelly graduated magna cum laude in 2007 and joined the Wall Street Journal that same year, covering real estate and economics. Her first bylines appeared during a financial crisis that was treacherous for investors but provided opportunities for young reporters to demonstrate their skill and versatility. Kelly quickly became the host of the journal's first online videocast, News Hub. She moved to CNBC in 2012. A winner of Washington and Lee's Outstanding Young Alumni Award, Kelly generously shares her time and talent with her alma mater. She moderated a mock convention debate between James Carville and Ann Coulter in 2012. Takes a lot of talent. And last winter gave a group of W&L students an insider's look at the New York Stock Exchange. Kelly was raised right here in Rockbridge County, and we are thrilled to welcome her home today.
Very kind.
Bill Miller is also known to many of you as a member of the Washington and Lee family. Bill graduated in 1972 with honors in economics. After service as a military intelligence officer, followed by studies in the PhD program in philosophy at Johns Hopkins, Bill became treasurer of the J.E. Baker Company before joining Legg Mason Capital Management in 1981. During 35 years at Legg Mason, Bill not only rose to the position of chairman and chief investment officer, but also achieved fame for beating the S&P 500 index for 15 consecutive years, from 1991 to 2005. The streak prompted the New York Times to call him the Joe DiMaggio of mutual fund investors. Fortune magazine described his investing style as iconoclastic, noting that Miller has spent decades studying free-thinking overachievers, and along the way he's become one himself. Currently the chairman and chief investment officer of his own firm, Miller Value Partners, Bill is also chairman emeritus of the board of trustees of the Santa Fe Institute, an independent nonprofit whose researchers endeavor to understand and unify the underlying shared patterns in complex physical, biological, social, cultural, technological, and even possible astrobiological worlds. Considered one of the Institute's most adventurous supporters, Bill has funded the Miller Omega program, which supports projects, individuals, and events that aspire to explore the frontiers of our understanding of the complex universe. He lives in Baltimore, cheers for the Ravens and the Orioles, reads Schopenhauer in his spare time, and owns Jake, the world's smartest bulldog.
World's smartest dog.
Dog. Dr. Harold Varmus was co-recipient of the 1989 Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine for the discovery of the cellular origin of retroviral oncogenes, the genetic basis of cancer. Currently, he's the Lewis Thomas University Professor of Medicine at Weill Cornell Medicine and a senior associate at the New York Genome Center. He was formerly director of both the National Institutes of Health and the National Cancer Institute. Although he entered Amherst College intending to prepare for medical school, he majored in English literature with a thesis on the novels of Charles Dickens and was editor of the college newspaper, The Amherst Student. Harold's deputy editor was none other than my father, Earl Dudley, his college classmate in the audience today. Together, they organized a demonstration at the White House in the spring of 1960 in support of the sit-ins to integrate Southern lunch counters, which landed them on the front page of the New York Times. Harold went on to earn a master's degree in English from Harvard, where his focus was on Anglo-Saxon and metaphysical poetry. But the pull of science proved too powerful, and he opted to enter medical school at Columbia rather than continue the pursuit of a career as a literary scholar. Harold was denied entrance to Harvard Medical School not once, but twice, causing him to observe there are more medical schools than Harvard. Harvard may not know that, but others do. Dr. Varmus's honors and awards are legion. His research has been groundbreaking, and I suspect Harvard regrets its decision to this day. Let's welcome Harold Varmus. Thank you.
That's great.
Judge Gregory Woods graduated magna cum laude from Williams College in 1991 with a major in art history. He then attended Yale Law School, where he distinguished himself with prizes for Best Brief and Best Oral Argument in the school's moot court competition. Greg began his legal career as a trial attorney with the Civil Division of the Department of Justice, where he focused on fighting fraud. He then moved to the private sector, rising to become a partner with the New York firm Debevoise & Plimpton, where he served on the firm's pro bono committee and the boards of several community organizations. Greg returned to Washington in 2009 to become Deputy General Counsel at the U.S. Department of Transportation, before becoming General Counsel at the U.S. Department of Energy in 2012. He was nominated by President Barack Obama in May 2013 to the U.S. District Court for the Southern District of New York. During his Senate confirmation hearing, Greg was asked which elements of judicial temperament he considers most important. He replied, "A judge should render objective, impartial, and fair decisions. A judge should also treat all who come before him or her with dignity and respect. I believe that the most important element in judicial temperament is moderation. A moderate, restrained temperament supports the judge's ability to render impartial and fair judgments in all cases solely on the basis of the law and facts presented in a case." The full Senate wisely confirmed Judge Woods by a voice vote. I will always think of Greg as a college freshman, which he was when we first met. Our intrepid moderator, Suzanne Keen, is the Dean of the College and the Thomas H. Broadus Professor of English at Washington and Lee, where she's been a member of the faculty since 1995. Suzanne received degrees in English literature and creative writing from Brown University before earning a master's and PhD in English language and literature at Harvard. She taught at Yale prior to arriving at W&L, where her courses have ranged from contemporary British fiction to literary approaches to poverty. She has combined a longtime devotion to the novel with insights gleaned from recent neuroscience, developmental and social psychology, and the science of emotions. Suzanne is a recognized authority on literary empathy. She was instrumental in launching the Digital Humanities Initiative at W&L, a collaborative effort involving faculty, librarians, and information technology professionals. Prior to being appointed dean in 2013, Suzanne served as the head of the English department and chair of several faculty committees. Let's welcome Suzanne. And with that, Dean Keen, take it away.
Thank you so much, President Dudley. It is a tremendous honor to be sharing the stage with these distinguished panelists on such a wonderful occasion, and thank you all for being here. A word to my panelists. I'm going to choose one of you to direct the question to first, but then the other three may follow and answer after that first person has had a chance to answer, but you're not obliged to. But the person that I choose first has to say something. All right. So the first question is going to be directed immediately to my right, to Dr. Varmus, to Harold. In my field, a prized form of analysis is close reading, which means careful examination of texts. But there are many other methods of analysis that we practice in our professions. Panelists, but starting with Harold, what are some of the fundamental modes of analysis, ways of thinking critically, that you find yourself relying upon in your professional lives? Did you begin to learn that way or a related way of critical thinking when you were in college?
Okay, I'm game to be the first, and
Thank you.
fellow panelists, please feel free to interrupt at any point. So I could say a lot about the kinds of analyses we do today as cancer biologists, but let me go back to the original SIN formula that you brought up. That is, how did we learn to analyze things? And to me, and the way I approach things, it all begins with the evidence. And I learned that message not in a science course, but through a course in literature in which I was exposed to the writings of I.A. Richards, a notable literary critic in the early part of the 20th century, who wrote a book called Practical Criticism, which emphasized the idea that when you think about poetry, you should not think about what others have said about that poet or his work or her work, but instead look at the words on the page. The words of the page are the evidence about what the poet intends to say. He tried to explore that simple notion through experiments, something that now appeals to me in retrospect as a scientist, by asking students of literature to interpret these poems. And many of them, of course, fell back on received opinions, but the best comments always came from people who looked at the actual words on the page and tried to understand what the words meant. Today, as a scientist, or as a political scientist, someone who works with the government to support science, unlike many in our current government, we are highly committed to making decisions about what to do next and how to interpret the world by looking at the evidence, which may not be complete or totally convincing, but beginning with what is delivered through scientific assays or as words on the page.
What a wonderful start.
I'll say that as a lawyer, one of the principal things that we do is exactly what you do, which is look critically at texts. We were looking, parsing through cases, statutes, regulations, looking for these minor differences in words. Does the jury instruction say you're to consider this simply for this purpose or solely for this purpose? They both begin with S and end with LY, but they have dramatically different meanings for the people that are looking at them. So we do a lot of textual analysis, which I learned in college, but I've been thinking about Will's introduction and the fact I was an art history major in college. And we spent in one of my classes time looking at the Mona Lisa and talking about it from different analytical and philosophical perspectives. And I think that we do a lot of that too as lawyers too. Unlike Dr. Varmus, we don't always have absolute truth in the law. We're sort of looking at different pieces of evidence from different perspectives. And that was something that I learned in college as an analytical approach, and is something that I continue to do in practice and in my job now.
Let me just briefly disabuse you of the idea that scientists believe in absolute truth.
That's what my doctor tells me.
Well, find another doctor. No, we make approximations. Science, the scientific view of things is always changing. One of the dangers of science is that as scientists, we admit that there's always more work to be done. That often becomes the argument against accepting climate change or accepting the idea that tobacco causes cancer. There's always more research to be done. That's not an excuse for accepting what we know now. Mm-hmm.
Would either of the two of you like to jump in on critical thinking?
Sure, I'll offer it. With respect to the liberal arts and the profession that I'm in, and the profession is really security analysis, trying to figure out how to analyze securities and think about them. The father of that is Benjamin Graham, who was trained as a classicist, and he studied classics and mathematics, and was, in fact, when he got out of Columbia, was offered a professorship in either area, but chose to go into capital markets. And he created kind of the taxonomy of securities analysis, and before him there was no such profession, and now it's a well-established profession. And one of the things that I think goes on in the profession that I'm in is the attempt to try and predict what's the economy going to do, what are companies going to do. And Benoit Mandelbrot, who invented fractal geometry, I think had a better take on that, where he said, failure to explain is due to failure to describe. What we're really trying to do is try and describe what's going on. And Danny Kahneman, who won the Nobel Prize in economics, it's a statement about economics that a person who never took an economics course, Dan Kahneman, would win the Nobel Prize in economics. You would not find that in physics, for example, or in any other profession. But Kahneman noted in what's called prospect theory, he said probabilities attached to the descriptions of events and not to the events themselves. And so I think one of the things that has been most influential in the way that I've thought about things, I took a philosophy course second semester senior year at W&L I never took a philosophy course before because this was in the late 1960s, early 1970s, and I thought philosophy was sort of a highfalutin way of navel gazing and not really anything much more than that. But I was curious and took the class in philosophy of language with Ramsey Martin, and it really opened my eyes in terms of rigorous analytical thinking. And one of the things that has been, and then I went to grad school in philosophy at Hopkins, as well noted. And one of the things that's really interesting about the philosophical approach, or philosophical analytical approach, is that if you think about the way that with the law, our legal system is constructed, it's constructed in an adversarial way. And so you're trying to knock down the other people's arguments, you're trying to defend your own. And in philosophy, one of the things that you're emphasized is that if you see an argument, and one of the great things about philosophy is that you learn in philosophy that there are really good arguments for really stupid, absurd positions. And so I think that one of the things that philosophy teaches you to do, and you're trained to do, is try and figure out not what's wrong with the other person's position, but what's wrong with it, but what can be made right with it? What's the strongest possible argument to be made for that position, and then see if you can weaken it. And that's one of the things that I think you can exploit in capital markets, which is that most people who are arguing for positions about whether they like Amazon or what they think the economy is going to do, they're really arguing for a position and really subject very much sort of confirmation bias and some other psychological issues like that. So I think a lot of what you learn in the liberal arts is directly applicable and ways of thinking to what I do.
I would just add, we talk about rigorous thinking, and the news media these days doesn't get a very good rap a lot of the time. When I started at the Journal, it was interesting that a place which has such a difficult and rigorous process for publication, one that brought me to tears every day, because it was, not just what's this piece of information that you're going to write about and publish for the paper, but do you have an illustrative anecdote to illustrate that? And if not, you better go find one right away. And it was several layers of editors who would come back and challenge your point of view on something, especially the more important the story, the more often that happens. So that certainly by the time something gets on the front page, it's been subjected to a number of people pushing back against your assumptions and saying, are you sure? Are you sure? And can you prove it? And for me, one of the difficulties with that ultimately is that a lot of the times it is very hard to prove it. So if we think about the types of stories we read, if you're going to take the Wall Street Journal as one example, if I'm told ahead of the time, and you can think about how the process of getting something that results in the front page works, we might know a month from now there's going to be a jobs report out, and we want to focus on the middle class and how they're doing, for example. So, Kelly, why don't you take 3 stats that give you a cross-section of how the middle class is suffering, for example, after the financial crisis, pick a town or a community that best illustrates the nexus of those things, and then find a family who's willing to go on the record and open up and talk about how it's affected them personally. And that process it's very difficult, obviously, and it puts the journalist in a tough position of having to really gain the trust of these people and then basically broadcasting their inner detail to the world. So keep that in mind when you're reading some of these stories. Never take for granted that you're able to get the inner workings of a family or a community, because it's very difficult to do, and it's really important for all of us to be able to relate to something that's happening. Anyway, so even when you get that right, the process is a little bit predetermined. And so one of the things that I like about journalism is not just, can you learn the craft, can you understand how to write a good story that's impactful, that summarizes something that's going on, but have you, as the journalist, come to the right conclusion? Are you bringing your assumptions into the story when you're writing it? And the process I've just described, it kind of sounds like you are. It kind of sounds like you've decided, I'm going to write a story about the struggling middle class and just find a way to illustrate it. So you really have to think hard about, have I got the core assumption right? Because if you're going to put something like that on the front page, you don't want to come back a month later and say, oh, no, never mind, actually the middle class is thriving, and here's why. It's not just your own point of view. You're basically establishing a point of view for the newspaper. So a paper that takes itself quite seriously, like the Journal, wants to make sure that they're getting it right. And one of the things that obviously 2016 has kind of taught everybody is that we need to think long and hard about whether the assumptions that we're bringing into even the most mundane or seemingly anodyne of these stories are actually appropriate, and are the reporters and editors being creative enough to give people the assignments that will produce the type of journalism that actually encapsulates what's happening in the country. So, for me, it's more thinking critically about the task with which you have been given, pushing back on that if you need to, and if you have a different point of view, being able to present evidence of why it's right, and then knowing that you're then going to put that point of view forward into the world and have the entire reputation of the paper, that's been around for 100+ years at stake. And that's true, of course, in television as well, but actually one of the things that I find freeing about television is that you're not so much producing one specific outcome like that. It's a little bit more obvious sometimes that I'm just up there, it's obvious when I might be presenting, some earnings that have happened. It's also obvious when we're just being playful and bantering with each other on air about our experience using a talking Amazon device or something. So for me, there is a lot of close reading of text that is not so much even about what is the story I'm reading about, but what were all of the assumptions that went into this along the way that I need to be thinking about before I come to any conclusions.
Just one quick comment in the interest of promoting conversation. I think, Suzanne, you asked for that.
Yes,
and
indeed.
to try to bring this back to liberal education, when I think about developing powers of analysis, and you heard me give an example, came not from a science course, but from a course in literature, it seems to me that what really works to stimulate analytic thinking among students is to start by asking them to answer questions and not by asking them to learn, to absorb something. I remember going to chemistry and physics courses at Amherst College and being told to repeat Newton's law of cooling experiment or to repeat the synthesis of some organic chemical. That was boring. I mean, either you got the right answer, you didn't, but you didn't really wonder about why you did or why you failed or not. But when you were asked a question to which the instructor might or might not know the answer, him or herself, you begin to think in a way that resembles what Kelly was trying to say a moment ago.
So I am going to address Greg.
Okay.
We don't happen to have a professional artist or performer on this panel, though we could. At W&L, we're proud of our alums who've achieved great things in the arts. I think that the creativity fostered by exposure to the arts shows up in many professions. What do you think? Is there a place for creativity in the professions that you practice?
Absolutely. As a lawyer, actually as a judge, I should say, I think I have a lot less room for creativity. I think part of my, you'll be happy to hear this. I think, in fact, my mandate is to be non-creative and boring. But as a lawyer, your job is to be creative, and it's to be creative in terms of constructing arguments that benefit your client, which require that you come up with some of those good arguments for bad positions sometimes that Bill was talking about. But it's more than just that, because if you think about, for example, what a trial is, or even just an intense negotiation, there's a lot of theater involved in that, and in presenting information to a jury. A lot of that is, frankly, visual, and a lot of the presentations that lawyers are giving to juries in my courtroom now, I have a trial starting on Monday, a lot of that is really visually oriented and trying to communicate information in a way that simplifies it for people that may be a very complicated concept. And so what you have to try to do is not just present it, but distill it and present it in a way that is engaging and that people can understand easily. And so I think a lot of what lawyers do is creative. I also have to say that a lot of what we do for fun is creative. I was just over at the law school and somebody asked me if I had any hobbies. My answer was no. But a lot of people that I work with really use it as an outlet. And so for me, I enjoy going and looking at art still. But a lot of people dance and sing and do all of those things, which actually are really important as ways to relax the strain that comes from a lot of the serious work that we do. So it has a role both in the real work and then in relaxing from the work.
I want to take off on that because one of the things I liked in grad school is I took a course in the philosophy of law. And it's interesting how somebody like Oliver Wendell Holmes completely changed the path of the law, which is one of his famous essays. But in his book, he starts out by saying that the life of the law has not been logic, it has been experience. And up until that time, people thought of law as kind of a syllogistic thing. And just through his reading of actually the words and the stuff and thinking about it, changed that. And just recently, and you might want to comment on this, Judge Posner just is retiring, who with his law and economic stuff, again, has changed very much the way that we think about law. So two very creative thinkers in that in that field. Andy Warhol said, as you may know, that business is an art as much as painting, or as much as painting. And, or to come at it differently, Will mentioned Schopenhauer. Schopenhauer thought that the arts were the highest form of human endeavor, and he pointed out that, well, he didn't point out, but it has been pointed out that if Einstein had never lived, or Newton had never lived, somebody else would have figured that stuff out. But if Mozart had never lived, or Dickens had never lived, no one would have recreated those particular things.
Can I take issue with that concept?
Sure.
You know, it is true that certain facts become apparent as a result of certain technical advances, but the way in which science is done is a creative process. And one example that's been written about a lot is the way in which Watson and Crick, for example, unveil the double helix of DNA, which is portrayed in my tie, and that there is an art and an aspect of imagination that goes into the story, which makes the story of discovery particularly fascinating. And that, yes, we would have figured out the double helix, we would have figured out oncogenes by some other means in the long run. I want to mention at some point one of your great graduates here at Washington and Lee, Joe Goldstein, is a Nobel laureate in physiology and medicine, who is renowned for his essays. In fact, there was a compilation of them in a book about art and science. Each year, when he is the head of the Lasker jury, delivers the pronouncements, he always does so in the context of the arts and science. And then indeed this year, he used as the basis for writing about this year's Lasker winners by showing a number of intriguing paintings by Magritte, Velázquez, and Picasso that illustrate a major point that he wants to make that's related to this question about creativity, that scientists love to solve problems, artists create problems. And that's something worth thinking about in a variety of contexts.
Just, I would add, I don't know if this is going to be a very popular view, but I don't see the arts and creativity as sort of synonyms. I just see the arts as a different kind of discipline like any, and I think within any discipline you could have a genius like Mozart, or you could have a genius like Steve Jobs, and then you have plenty of people who are just imitating those who came prior. So to me, creativity and innovation are extremely closely linked, and it's one reason why I love covering business journalism in the sense of, you know, who are the people that are creating these ideas that are going to change our physical world and our experience with it? And even a guy like Elon Musk, who we like to bash for having an overpriced, stock, is still out there coming up with ideas about creating a system of hyperloops and, you name it. They have private space travel now, which again, that itself is not the innovative idea, but to be able to kind of bring that society's resources to bear upon that took a lot of innovation and creativity in order to accomplish it. So I see all of these different professions as having some thinkers who are able to just kind of be extremely creative in a different type of way. And even something as mundane as television, there's a template which we can follow every day, doing the same thing that everyone before us has done. Or some of our best moments come from us sitting down and saying to each other, wait a minute, how can we actually do this better? And what if we take this idea from a completely different field or discipline, or this word or phrase that I saw, and what if we come up with a way to do that and bring the show together in a different way? So, again, it's simple, but it's creative and it's innovative. And I think that there are people who worship those who have achieved that in business the same way they would worship a guy like Mozart or some of the, amazing legal and scientific minds. I don't think there's any reason why the arts themselves need to be overly obsessed with this idea that they're creative.
One of the points you're making here is that there are two ways to view arts and creativity. One is an activity you participate in while you have the other parts of your life to deal with. And you were alluding to that at one point, Greg. And the other is the creativity that goes into just having ideas about what you do. I was reading an essay on the plane this morning about the question of bad ideas. Famous scientist, and I think it actually was Einstein, because every great idea is attributed to Einstein these days, but Einstein said that every good scientist I know has about 20 times more bad ideas than good ideas, and that the total number of ideas you have is probably more reflective of how well you're going to do in life than just scoring a high percentage of successful ones.
Well, I'm going to move on to my next question, which is directed to Kelly first, and the others can then chime in. We like to say that a liberal education prepares a learner to be able to deal with change, to learn new things, how to do new things. Can you reflect on a time when you had to adapt to a whole new way of thinking or executing your work, precipitated by a change, whether that change was unexpected or deliberately sought out? And I think this is a chance for the panelists to tell us their great stories.
That's a lot of pressure, but I think my husband, maybe my classmate Lindsay over there, can probably vouch for the fact that I'm a different person every day that I wake up, and that's usually a good thing. And it's usually, and that's why, so if anyone out there isn't familiar with Charlie Munger and his writings, I would encourage you to get Poor Charlie's Almanac or get your hands on any of his speeches or, any of his remarks that might be out there on Google. One of the things that most struck me about Munger was when I saw what he talks about when it comes to inversion. And he says, whenever you reach or are in the middle of a very difficult problem or personal situation, invert it. And he'll say, invert, invert, invert. And I love that because so many times in life I found myself in these situations where I realize I need to have done everything the completely different opposite way. And it's very liberating for a guy who's as wise and successful and learned as him to say, any year in which you haven't changed your mind on something major is a wasted year. And, for me personally, the ability sometimes to just declare bankruptcy in my previous mode of doing things and wake up and just try something different the next day has resulted in some of my biggest, quickest successes. I'm aware that it's come from me doing it the wrong way first, having to be humiliated, whether it's in a more personal way or a much more public way, and say, you know what, maybe I should try a totally different approach. I've done that so many times, I've completely lost count. I've probably done it 5 times already today.
Well, since we operate in a similar realm, I'll take up on that. I can't think of a time since I've certainly been in capital markets and even before, when I wasn't trying to struggle to adapt to change, because that's all about change. In fact, when I got out of W&L, 1972, the companies that today are the 5 largest companies by market capitalization in America, Apple, Google, Facebook, Amazon, and Microsoft, didn't exist. So they're completely different. And then when I got into the capital markets world in 1982, that was after the 1970s big inflation. Interest rates were 14%. There was a generalized view among people that were in the money management business at the time that inflation would come back, oil prices would come back, and the people that held those dogmatic views and didn't change were washed out of the business 4 or 5 years later. 1987, the stock market crashed for the first time since 1929, and it was a unique event, and certainly of the lifetimes of the people operating in the markets then. And the general view from that, as people looked back at history, looked backwards, was, well, you have to go to cash, because when stock markets crash, when they've had that in 1929 most recently, then we have a depression. And so we're likely to have a depression, so go to cash. Well, that was the case when trying to think through things. 1929 and 1987 were radically different in terms of their economics, and I won't go into it except to say that view about going to cash was 100% wrong. We had gone to cash before that, and then we put all our cash to work after the crash, and we're fortunate enough to be the #1 fund in 1988. And now recently, just recently, we've had interest rates at the lowest level in the 5,000 years of recorded history. Economists didn't think that you could go below the so-called lower bound, 0 interest rates. But you still have negative interest rates in many parts of the world. So if you borrow money in Switzerland to buy a house, they send you a check every month for borrowing the money. That was something that we've never seen before. So trying to deal with those sorts of things and trying to think through them is I think the stuff that you learn in a liberal arts education, of looking at things in different ways. The best analysts that I've had over the course of my career have not been, by and large, mathematicians or physicists or people like that. They've been liberal arts majors. A woman who was an American Studies major at Yale, a guy who was an English major at William and Mary, and part of it is that, and it's not peculiar, it's not unique to liberal arts. Obviously, scientists and physicists can think creatively and look at things in a variety of different ways. But one of the things is that if you're trying to figure out, think about Moby Dick, you look at it this way, that way, and try and interpret it, and there'll be different kinds of interpretations and different kinds of descriptions, and one or more of those will fit things better or worse. And so right now, for example, one of the issues that you see dividing a lot of people in capital markets and the economy is the issue of cryptocurrencies, Bitcoin. So Jamie Dimon, who I have great respect for, said the other day that Bitcoin was a fraud. Howard Marks, one of the greatest investors of our generation, called it a Ponzi scheme about 3 months ago. He subsequently changed his view. Warren Buffett called it a mirage 5 years ago. And the great line that was made about Buffett, that somebody asked me about Jamie Dimon's comment on Bitcoin the other day, and I referred to Buffett, and I said there's Mark Andreessen, who basically invented the web browser, when asked about Buffett's comment about Bitcoin, had the classic line where he said, "The record of old white men who do not understand technology crapping on new technologies they don't understand is 100%. So, I'll leave it at that.
Well, and in the interest of time, I'm just going to speak very briefly to this issue. It goes without saying that if you're a scientist, you're operating in a world of change every day. If your own field is not changing, you're in the wrong field. It's a field in which there's nothing to be learned anymore, or there aren't tools available to do it. One thing that you may not be aware of is that what changes in the world of a scientist is not just new discoveries, it's new technologies. And there's no doubt that for those of us trying to understand certain fundamental questions, in my own case, the question most to my mind these days is, how does a normal cell become a cancer cell? And what can we do to protect patients against cancer as a result of what we learn from that? And the answers to those questions are dramatically influenced by technology that's available. So when it became possible to clone individual genes from cells, when it became possible to quickly determine the nucleotide sequence of DNA, when it became possible to take cells and go into live cells with molecular tools to edit genes, all of these have changed the face of research in a dramatic way. And if you don't learn those technologies and learn what they're good for, you simply don't thrive.
I'll just say, the world is always changing, but also we have the opportunity to change ourselves, like Kelly was saying. And through my career, if you heard Will's introduction, it sort of sounds linear. It sounds like I went to law school, and then I worked at the Justice Department, then I worked at a big firm. Each one of those jobs was really different. Litigating cases and then going to a big firm where I did a lot of corporate and transactional work, and then going into government where I was responsible for helping to run big legal departments, which is a management job, and also involved in regulation and lots of other topics. Each one of those jobs shifts required, I'll call it, a lot of courage to feel comfortable really jumping off of a ledge. I had my law degree and that sort of basic set of skills that comes with that. I can read and talk. But then to go in and plug it into different environments required learning something new and feeling comfortable with going in and teaching myself something new, which is really challenging. And I'll say especially my last couple of jobs at Department of Energy, I worked for a Nobel laureate. For lawyers, we spend a lot of time trying to understand what it is that our clients do or that their businesses do. And so we're constantly having to learn what it is that we're talking about, which is, or you may not think that we're getting there. But that's a real challenge, and I think that's even within the job, especially within the law, we're constantly having to try to master and adapt to different areas and fields.
I'm going to hazard a guess, based on the biographies of these panelists, that I'm sitting in the company of people who love books and reading. And the gentleman to my left, the technical term for him is he is a ringer. Bill, do you have any thoughts about the centrality of reading in the life of a liberally educated person?
I have a few views on that, yes. Kelly mentioned Charlie Munger, and one of the things that Charlie said, he tends to be very provocative. He said that he had never, he's 92 years old, he said in his long life he'd never met a single wise person, not one, who was not an avid reader. And his partner Warren Buffett reads like 8 to 10 hours a day, and hired 2 guys to help him manage Berkshire Hathaway's money, and he described them as books with legs. That's their, but yeah, I think wide reading is essential, certainly in the profession that I'm in. I can't say I've never met a good investor who wasn't an avid reader. I know of one, but she's a complete maniac and sort of an idiot savant. But everybody else that I know of in the investment business is a wide reader. And I think that the value of the liberal arts, people ask a lot of times about what are the humanities good for and that stuff. And I really like the line that Stanley Fish had, where he said, he was asked about the value of the humanities versus STEM, and he said, well, that the humanities are good for nothing. He said they're good in themselves. They're not good for instrumental reasons. You don't study them for something else. You study them because they're good in themselves. But they do have instrumental value. Many of you, or some of you, may have heard of Admiral Stockdale, who was the longest-serving prisoner of war in the Vietnam War, won the Medal of Honor, and was the commander of all the prisoners in the Vietnam War, and was 7 years tortured. And when his plane was being shot down, and his plane was going down into North Vietnam, he said in his book, Reflections of a Philosophical Fighter Pilot, he said he thought to himself, I'm leaving the world of technology and entering the world of Epictetus, the Stoic philosopher. And he had been trained at the Naval Academy and as a technologist, and was in graduate school at Stanford. When he walked by a classroom, there was a professor teaching philosophy, and he'd never heard anything like this, so he went in and sat down and began to study philosophy, and especially Stoicism, with great diligence. And after he got out of prisoner of war camp, he said that it was singly responsible for him and the lives of all the people there, that the study of philosophy. So, and I'll just end, like you said, about recommend a book or two.
Yeah, I want a book recommendation.
Okay, well, I'd recommend Stockdale's book. I think that's good. We talked a little bit earlier about Middlemarch. My son is an English professor and had urged me when he was an undergrad and all to read Middlemarch, and I said, yeah, and I never read it. And then when he got I said, I'll read it when you get your PhD. So when he got his PhD, I just sat down and read it all the way through, and I think it's an extraordinary book. I think Stanley Fish's his work, it's very provocative, but I think it's good. One of the latest ones is a book called Think Again. And then just a couple other ones. I think as a way to kind of ease your way into philosophy, anything by William James is fantastic. I think his lectures, Pragmatism, I think are probably the most important intellectual document in American history. But his essays on the will to believe, the sentiment of rationality, what makes a life significant, are really good. And then what I'm trying to do this year is kind of read through systematically stuff, because at my late age I probably won't read these classics again. So stuff that I haven't read. So I'm trying to work my way through War and Peace right now. I read Moby Dick again this year for the second or third time. And then I think there's some little stuff. We talked about James Joyce's The Dead, which is a beautiful little novella. And then there's a provocative little book. I'll begin on Charlie Munger and end on Charlie Munger, that he says is the best scientific essay he'd ever written. It's in a little book form. It's called Ice Age by John Gribben, who's a physicist, and he just talks about how science uncovered that we did have ice ages. But there's some really interesting stuff about that as it relates to global warming that I think you would find interesting.
I can just quickly add, I read voraciously. I wonder a little bit, because even just to do my job, I have to read so many different newspapers and different things every day that there's not really time for anything else. And I do wonder, even as I look around sort of the rest of the people in the news business, how much content people are actually able to consume and how much of it is just sort of glancing through tweets and email highlights and all the rest, and how much actual deep reading is taking place. But my book recommendation would be a book called One Summer by Bill Bryson. It's about 1927. And this sort of dovetails with my one big regret about W&L, which is that I didn't take more history. And no offense to Professor Lucky and Richardson over there, but I wish that I had basically spent all my time over there in the history department instead. So I've had some catching up to do.
I'm not going to spend any time. Yes, I love to read, but I think that goes without saying for all of us up here. I'm not going to recite a reading list, but I would point out one or two things. Mr. Miller and I had a moment of agreement here. Middlemarch would be the one novel I say everybody must read in life. If not that, Anna Karenina. We can read both. And some people might be curious to know what I would think would be a great introduction to science. And there are a lot of books I could mention, but one that you may not be aware of is a book called The Age of Wonder by Richard Holmes about science, especially astronomy and chemistry in the 19th century and its connection to poetry. The Age of Wonder. And the other I would mention is a book about the origins of molecular biology called The Eighth Day of Creation. Wonderful introduction, very accessible.
I won't give you a reading list either. I'll tell you my solution to the problem that Kelly's describing is because I read a lot every day. I listen to a lot of books on tape, which is a great way to fill in those quiet moments with other information about what's going on in the world or happening.
Better than talking to your wife while you drive, for example.
What's that? Sorry, I didn't hear you.
I think listening counts. The Homer's first readers were all listeners. All right, so this one is a bit of a toss-up, but it has a W&L focus, so I think I'm going to turn back to Kelly to start us off. One of the things that I especially prize as a teacher in a liberal arts college is the way that our students engage in a process of self-invention and reinvention during the college years. This can happen in so many arenas, including extracurricular activities such as varsity athletics or community service. At W&L, one of the most enduring contributions to character formation occurs among students themselves as they own and operate our honor system. They internalize a sense of personal integrity through that investment. Kelly, what do you think the core aspects of a liberally educated character are?
Thank you. By the way, I didn't know what liberal arts meant. I think even when I graduated, I still wasn't really. I mean, I knew basically that I didn't have to be. I wasn't going to engineering school, and that there were a lot of majors to pick from at W&L. But, in retrospect, a lot of this makes so much more sense. And when you're 17 years old, looking for colleges, not with a defined vision of what I definitely wanted to do, but knowing that I needed enough opportunities. And wasn't W&L a fantastic place because it really offered so much. I mean, for such a small school to have a business school and a journalism school and a science school and, just music and all the rest of it, it was one of the things that attracted me. So in my mind, that's kind of what liberal arts represented. And then interestingly enough, I ended up being a journalism major, which is much more of a trade-oriented thing, which frankly was a blessing because it got me into the workforce right away. And I'm very, very, very grateful for that. Which is all my way of saying that I actually think the most important thing about W&L is the honor code and sort of the character emphasis that it places. It's completely unique, and I can definitely say that living in New York and, interacting with tons and tons of people who didn't go to Washington and Lee and maybe aren't from the South, and maybe some of it's cultural. But as far as I'm concerned, whatever happens with the number of majors that are offered and different general education requirements or not, the most important, lasting thing is the honor code and the speaking tradition in particular. And I just think it's a night and day difference for me between the types of interactions I might have with people where character formation is very important to them or has been an important part of their upbringing, and those for whom it has not been. And that chasm can be very difficult to bridge later in life.
I agree with that 100%, and I'll make it tangible, because when I was at W&L, I guess I knew I was going to go in the military because it was during the Vietnam time, and I got a terrible low draft number, but I went up to actually look at some potential schools for grad school when I got out. And so I went up to Columbia. First place I went was New York City. I drove up there and I was going to crash with a friend of mine who was at Columbia, and so I naively parked my car on Riverside Drive, but I locked it up, so I didn't have to do that here at W&L, so I locked it all up. But I made the mistake of actually having stuff in the car that was visible, so when I came out the next morning, the windows were all smashed out, and suitcase gone, books gone, everything was gone. So that crystallized in my mind. I said the benefit of the honor system, and just to give you a little enlightenment about what liberal arts means. It comes from the Roman word liber.
Susan, this is not a pejorative statement about Columbia, I hope.
No.
Oh, no.
No.
I think it's just New York.
It's New York. I love Columbia.
Well, that may have built some character in you.
Yeah, it did probably. Yeah, certainly increased my wariness. Yeah. But it comes from the Roman word liber, which means free, and so I think part of what at least the implication is that liberal arts free you from your insularities, your prejudices, open you up to new things.
I mean, character can get built in lots of ways. I don't think it's the job of liberal arts education to build character necessarily. It might happen if the right tools are there and people have the right experiences, but I know an awful lot of people of esteemed character who never had a liberal arts education, but they had experiences in other maybe experiences, parents, creeds, things that help build character, and can happen in any aspect of life's activities.
I agree with Harold. I was thinking I sentenced somebody yesterday who was a career criminal. He'd been convicted 15 times before this time. And he stood up in front of me at the sentencing and he said, Your Honor, I always before I understood, I thought I was just hurting myself, but this time I understand that I've been hurting the people around me. And I believed him. And that's one thing that I do see in people that go to liberal arts colleges. I think that people have a sense of what's going on in the people around them. Whether that then leads to great character, I don't know. But it's a characteristic that they have.
So the development of an empathetic awareness. Yeah, good. All right, I'm turning a page. All right. So,
We're coming near the end.
oh, we've got so much to say.
Oh, good.
Don't you worry. So, I'm just going to throw this one open. Anybody can jump in or refute if that's your mood. How do you recognize liberally educated people in your walk of life? Does a liberal education show?
I can't say it does.
I think it's
No?
the sweatshirt.
Oh, you can buy a sweatshirt, Greg.
No, it doesn't show?
I don't know if I can see that somebody has a liberal education. I can see if somebody is open-minded, open to challenge, creative. But like Harold says, in the same way that you can develop character in lots of different ways, I think that you can learn those skills in lots of different ways. I think that a liberal arts education focuses on those things, so maybe more likely that somebody that has those characteristics is a liberal arts graduate. But I don't think, wow, this is a Washington and Lee graduate when I meet the person who's got those characteristics.
Or even an Amherst graduate.
Or even an Amherst graduate.
Yeah, I mean,
I won't tell you what I think when I see an Amherst graduate.
Now, this is a Williams Amherst thing. It's really very boring, but we've got to play this game. But I think the important thing is that as we become acquainted with people, we learn about the breadth of their interests, the breadth of their sympathies, their analytic capacities. You can get those in a variety of places. I'd like to think, as a graduate of a liberal arts college like Amherst, and as a visitor sympathetic to the goals of this college, that a liberal arts curriculum helps. I have been concerned, I have to say, in the way in which some liberal arts colleges, I don't know much about your curriculum, but everything I've gathered from ambling around this campus today and spending some time in the science centers, that people do get broad exposures. But I have been concerned that in contrast to the days when Will's father and I were at Amherst College and everybody took calculus, everybody took history, everybody took basic English composition. We all had a common experience of a diverse set of topics that because of pressures for college admission, there is a tendency to advertise your school as a place where you, as an incredibly smart young student, can decide which courses you're going to take. And there are very few even area requirements in schools that are most competitive. I'm perhaps now old enough to think naively that people should be, if not forced, at least deeply encouraged to diversify their experience, so that later on, when any of us meet them, we think this is a person of pretty broad exposure to a lot of things.
What do you guys think? Does liberal education show? Kelly's already said no.
Well, not that it doesn't, but that, yeah, I just think there's so many other markers that I can kind of identify somebody as being just kind of interested in the world or not. And I'd like to think there's a lot of overlap between those two, but it's not that it would have especially jumped out to me.
I think that I'd draw a distinction, which might have been drawn down here, between a liberal arts education and being liberally educated. And so I think that someone who can be I know Murray Gell-Mann, the great physicist, who is a polymathic genius, but but I mean, his expertise is physics, but he knows everything else, so he's very widely read. And I think just in general, the characteristics of someone who's liberally educated is wide reading, intellectual curiosity, the ability to draw from different sources, art, music, philosophy, history, as well as science. I mean, and all of these things, I think, can contribute to a point of view. And the more sources you can draw from, I think the better chance you are at hitting on something that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
Well, it may seem entirely superfluous after all of the wisdom that has already been shared, but my next question is actually a question intended to be aimed at the students in the audience. So I am wondering what advice my 4 panelists would have for the students who are here. What would you advise them as they go out into this world?
Well, I just don't believe in giving advice of a general sort to a lot of people. Advice ought to be individualized. And the only advice I would give is to any students who are here is that you know how to get advice. That is, you know the person to go to, you know the kinds of questions to ask. You're on a campus with a lot of highly motivated faculty who are interested in promoting your welfare. You go to classes, you hear them speak, you find some more attractive than others, and certainly at my somewhat similar college, Amherst College, one of the virtues of being in a fairly small campus is you can go to those professors and not to a graduate student who runs your discussion groups, and you can bring to the person who seems sympathetic and well-versed in something you want to know more about, and ask them for advice that they can make personal for you.
I don't mind just saying as sort of a broad thing, and again, all this usually speaks from experience, but that, I think in terms of personal development, it's just important to get in touch with, listen to, and understand the voice of your own conscience. And I think that can be very hard to do at times, especially, in such a cacophonous culture and with so much social media and social pressure that has always existed. But I think that would be my advice, is to recognize the primacy and importance of that and try to cultivate that.
I do have what I think is a general piece of advice that is somewhat useful. I think one of the things that would be helpful, if I'd done this when I was a student, is if you look around your classmates and look at the people that you admire and you think are going to do well, and then generalize that out to people out in the world, people in history, and make a list of why you admire them. What are the traits that they have that cause you to admire them? And then turn that and invert it and say, okay, now let's go the other way. Who are people that I don't admire, that I don't think, and then what are their traits? And then try and cultivate the former and avoid the latter. And then maybe just more practically for those of you that are end up going into business. I gave a talk here some years ago that I was reminded of today where I gave some advice, and the most pertinent piece of advice is that when you go into business, you have really one thing that you really need to do to be successful, which is please your boss. Make your boss happy. Yep. No one ever got fired because the boss thought they were doing a great job. Mm-hmm. And every person I know that's ever gotten in trouble, it's because they and the boss have a problem, and they think that they know more than the boss. And how do you please the boss? It's also pretty easy. You do what the boss says. And you do it with a sense of urgency, a good attitude, and you try and bring some creativity to do an even better job and maybe solve more of the problems. And then I'll end on the flip side of that, which is one of the, there's all this advice that goes out to people about their career and all. And one of the worst pieces of advice that I've seen offered to people is they tell you that, you're in charge of your own career. You need to make sure that you get what you deserve and you get what you need and you fight for what you're going to do. That's a recipe for getting in big trouble. I mean, what you really want to do in your career is you want to make sure that you are always underpaid. And the reason you want to be underpaid is when you're underpaid, you're creating more value than you're being compensated for. And if your boss is rational, he or she will realize that, and you'll be a very valuable person. But if you're overpaid, then that's very bad because you're not delivering the goods, and they'll figure out a way to get rid of you. So I think that being underpaid is one of the most undervalued things around.
That's going to be hard to follow.
I don't know. I'm sorry. the things that, just a couple of...
You're probably underpaid.
I'm very much underpaid. But all of you are paying my salary, so you don't think so. Just a couple of things responding to what Bill said. He's describing all those people that you see and you admire. One thing I wish that I had done when I was on campus in college was I wish I hadn't been so intimidated by those people. I wish that when I was a college student I had reached out more and engaged more, realized that sort of everybody puts their pants on in the morning, and made more friends with some of the people that Bill's describing. The other thing I'd say off of what Bill said about please your boss, do what your boss says, I'd also say do what your boss didn't think to ask you to do, but he really or she really wanted you to do. That's really useful. I'll just say two other pieces of advice and then I have an entreaty. Another piece of advice is to be courageous. Put yourself in a situation that challenges yourself. For me, I don't know if I can do something, but I'm willing to put myself there and then see if you can do it. That forces you to grow, and I think it's really good. I'd also say exercise and sleep, which I didn't do enough, and eat well. And then my entreaty is read the whole paper. My pet peeve recently has been that people get all their news from their news feed, and so you don't necessarily see what's going on in the things that are not being pushed to you. And I think that in order to be good contributors to civic society, I think we need to have a broader perspective, which I think you get if you read the paper cover to cover, and I think it will help us be better citizens and better able to engage with others.
You won't have time to read Middlemarch then.
There is that, but I'm sure it's on Audible.
Harold, you like to give specific advice to specific people in specific circumstances. Is that what I gather?
In general.
All right.
So, for example, be the boss.
I have a question for you.
Okay.
So we are here today because we're inaugurating a new president at Washington and Lee. And one thing that I can tell you for sure about every single person in this audience is that we all care deeply about this university, about its students, about the people who were shaped by being here, and about its future. So given that circumstance, what advice would you offer to President Dudley on the occasion of his inauguration?
Okay, well, I don't know enough about Washington Lee to make specific policy proposals to him, but I have run 3 big organizations, and the one thing that I think was a sort of takeaway message from those experiences is to lay out a plan that people in that organization, and I'm talking about elements of the National Institutes of Health or Memorial Sloan Kettering, where I was president for 10 years, spend a few months, learn what the problems are, what are the deficiencies, what are the strengths, what do you want to do, choose 3, 4, or 5 things you'd like to achieve, tell everybody in a town meeting in a hall like this what you want to do, in what order, and how, and why, and keep track of that. Don't try to do too much. Make a plan for 5 or 10 years, and unless you are extremely unusual, plan to be out of that job in 5 to 10 years.
Anybody else want to take that one? Advice for our new president.
I will answer it this way, to say that I avoid giving advice on subjects I know nothing whatsoever about, and running a university is one of those subjects. But I wish you all the best.
And of course, he is the boss.
I wish Wilt the best too. I mean, I've never run a university, so like Harold, I'm not going to give any specific advice. But I've managed big groups of people, and that's the one thing I would say is just to focus on the human beings that you're working with and leading, and understand what their strengths are, and try to entice the best from them.
All right, well then we have done a magnificent job, because we have reached the point at which you all now have a chance to ask questions of our panelists. And I understand from John Lindbergh that somebody out here has a microphone. Is that right? Okay, right there. And that person will travel to where you are. And if the microphone itself can't reach you, You can speak to that person, and your question will be repeated into the microphone so that everybody can hear it. And then we'll know who's being asked the question, and we'll hear what's next. So let the games commence. Any question for any of our panelists?
There's a willing.
Yep, there you go. Couple up in the back.
Thank you.
In light of what's happening in this country recently, what advice do you have, or not so much advice, but what ideas do you have about the possibility of changing the name of this institution to be a politically correct name and drop the name Lee?
We thought we might get this question. Did we? Wait, let me just say one thing, which is I was at a dinner just a couple of weekends ago with politician types and a lot of New York and New Jersey people, and I just was telling people a little bit of the story of Washington and Lee, and they aren't really familiar with the details of it. We are familiar with it. We've heard it. We're surrounded by it. We know it. But I think especially from a communications point of view, I think it's really important that W&L tell its story and tell the story of what Robert E. Lee did here and who he was and, some of the things that he started and kind of just remind everybody who we are, how we got here. And, as it goes to the media, you can kind of flood the zone. I don't think you need to stay on the defensive and think, oh, we don't need to talk about these things. I think you talk about them. And I think you talk about how they came to be this way and, bring it, just like we would always say, bring a variety of people's different viewpoints to the surface on that. But I think, sort of trying to hide it or be ashamed of it is you need to tell people what it's all about. And there's a lot that nobody has any clue about. And I think educating people on all that is really important.
I think I'm reminded of something that Eric Greitens wrote that's on this general topic. He is, as you may or may not know, the governor of Missouri, the youngest or second youngest governor in the country, but he was a Navy SEAL, Rhodes Scholar, PhD in politics from Oxford. And in one of his books, he said that for people that we admire or that we put up statues to, he said it's childish to believe that they have to be flawless. And he said, and we can admire them for the things that they did that are great while not condoning what they might have done otherwise. And he mentioned Thomas Jefferson. He said Jefferson owned slaves. He impregnated someone, probably raped her. He said, but we can honor Jefferson for his services to the country while condemning that. And I think, and he mentioned Richard Wagner, and he said we can all acknowledge the great genius of Wagner as a composer while denouncing his anti-Semitism. And so I think that my personal opinion about Lee is, well, two things. One of them is I think it would behoove everybody to get some perspective by reading the New York Times obituary of Robert E. Lee when he died, because obviously the New York Times is no friend of Lee nor friend of the South, but I think it'll open your eyes. Now, what was I going to say? I forgot what I was going to say about. I think we can honor Lee for what he's done for this university, and I think that's appropriate. I do have if it comes down to changing the name, I do have a proposal for the Board of Trustees, which is if it becomes so difficult and the pressure is so great that the name has to be changed, then the Board of Trustees should say that they acknowledge that the time is long past to honor George Washington and Robert E. Lee, and we need to change the name of the university, and we need to honor different people. And so henceforth, we will honor Booker T. Washington and Bruce Lee, and honor the accomplishments of our African American. And Booker T. Washington, I'm told, was born close to here anyway. But it would save us a lot of money in changing logos and stationery and stuff like that.
The black law students say Denzel Washington and Spike Lee.
Yeah.
Is there another question that we can get the microphone to?
Hi there. My name's Hannah. I'm a senior at Washington and Lee University. And my question stems from a sympathy to all of you who studied very different fields, science and poetry, philosophy and economics, business and journalism. As a major in 2 different fields myself, my question is, how did you settle on a career path? Did you feel in control of your future when you were graduating from a liberal arts university with very different interests? And what advice do you have to liberal arts students with specific regards to a career path?
Oh, let me just volunteer that after I went to Rockbridge County High School, and so by the sort of sophomore year, I was eager to get out of town. So I took an internship early on at Bank of America in Charlotte, which was alluded to, and immediately was thrown into this world of business and finance that I had no idea existed, and came back to campus, declared business journalism as a major, and I'm skipping a few steps, but I basically realized I had a huge competitive advantage as a journalist if I was going to be a business journalist than if I was just one of a couple million journalists in the country who would be graduating into the job market every year. And so that, for me, was it helped that it was also my interest, but it was also a tactical decision, and it really opened sort of the whole career path for me pretty much right from the get-go and worked out really well.
Let me give just a somewhat different perspective. I'm a believer, at least in my own case, in the idea of a prolonged adolescence. And I really didn't know what I wanted to do until I was about 30. And I think that's okay. Life is long, thanks to advances in medical science. And
that's a relief, because I'm still not sure what I want to do. So.
And I think I prospered because I did spend years doing things that actually are not even particularly applicable to the professional things I do today. They were enriching experiences, and the fact that I wandered from one field to another for quite a few years until I found my true love in doing basic science, well, that all built a repertoire of skills and interests, and I don't think anybody needs to feel they're in a huge rush to settle on a career path.
Any other takers on that question? All right. Is our microphone person on the move? It looks like there are hands.
Thank you. I'm a lawyer, went to law school here at Washington Lee, but I also was a philosophy and English major here as an undergrad. As we have more and more demands on our schedules, I am struggling with my desire to read philosophy, read literature, and the time. As we heard Judge Woods talk about audiobooks, I sort of feel like I'm cheating when I do that, and I can't get mustard and ketchup on the book and then page back 100 pages and see what was said. How do you all view it as a vehicle to absorb in this fast-paced society? Do you prefer the audio if we can't? So I guess I'm asking quality versus quantity, and how do you view that?
I want to know, has Bill gone to audiobooks? Are you an audiobook guy?
No.
I listen to audiobooks all the time. I do it while I'm exercising. It's a great way to read if you can't otherwise spare the time. I'm sure you're reading a lot during your day job. I hope it's fine. There's some books where I'm going to say it's okay. I'll tell you, there are some books, thinking about the conversation about Robert E. Lee, I listened to the Shelby Foote Civil War books, which I think are fantastic. They'd be on my list of great history books. And I bought all those in the hard copies because I wanted to flip through and look at the maps and stuff. So I think that is an option. Or you could buy it, just put ketchup on it.
I think the bigger debate is about iBooks and books in hard copy. I listen to quite a few books in the car. We have a place in the country. I drive up there. My wife and I listen to all kinds of interesting things, and if they're well read, it's a lot of fun, and it's a way of making efficient use of time. But I think the bigger question in my mind is whether we're going to move away from books in hard copy to a world in which almost everything is simply read online. I'm still very happy lying in bed with a real book that I can mark up, and I agree going back and forth can be cumbersome if you're reading complicated histories and you want to look at genealogies, or reading Anna Karenina, want to look at family constellations. So there's still a lot for me in the hard copy, but when I go on a trip and I don't want to take 10 volumes, putting my iPad in my suitcase is a good thing. So I just think it's nice to live in a world where all these options exist and they suit different people at different times in different ways.
And by the way, this is an innocent question. The current debate that I'm hearing is it okay to listen to my audiobook on 3x speed? Or or is 2x too, is 1.5, is regular? I know so many people, I'm agnostic on this, but I know so many people who consume so many audiobooks and podcasts at fast speed. It is so common, I don't understand it. Maybe in a few years I'll be doing the same thing. It sounds like helium speak to me, but people swear, I guess it's the equivalent to, there's different kinds of reading, obviously. For what you're describing, it sounds like you need, whether it's the audiobook or the traditional reading experience, but if you're effectively skimming the newspaper by skimming around through audio content, for example, I guess hearing it super fast is not so much different, but that's something else that people are doing.
I do have a tip for you in that. If you're a competitive person, as I am, then one way to deal with that is so. For example, Ron Daniels, who's the president of Johns Hopkins, he and I were talking about books earlier in the summer and explaining what books we wanted to read. And so we decided, okay, we're going to get together at the end of September and see if we actually read these things. He's trying to read Ulysses and War and Peace at the same time. So you don't want to lose, right? You don't want to show up and say, I didn't do my assignment. So I think that's a useful thing, is to set a goal and then see with somebody else and see if you can meet it.
All right, I felt sure I saw other hands in the air.
There's one right
Yeah,
there.
there's one right there. We can try to reach Mason.
1.5x speed. Yeah, I do that sometimes too.
Might be able to hear you.
Yeah, we hear you.
Be really loud.
So, you all are obviously really impressive careers. I wonder how you interact with people in your professional setting who went to public school and defend your very, 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 very expensive liberal arts education to them when now you're at the same stage in your career.
I've never been accused of having had it. I mean, what's the defense?
The money. The expense of a liberal arts education, which is skyrocketing.
Mm-hmm. But that's another question. That's not defending our own choice to do this. I think the question of how we control costs of education a lot of it comes back to what schools are going to be able to do to provide income-free admission and provide scholarship support for students who otherwise couldn't afford to go there. And that's, there's a raw fact of life here having to do with the fact that education is expensive. But I don't feel that we have to defend the system so much as we have to fix it, and so that more people have more access to the kinds of learning that you get here.
Yeah, I can't say that I would tell a young person today, oh, you have to go to a pricey liberal arts school. In fact, I'd probably tell them the opposite. I mean, it'd be an atrocity for me to tell somebody you have to saddle yourself with that much debt before you're starting out. I had a lottery ticket, I had a scholarship, and it meant that I could take a post-grad internship in New York City with no sense of whether I'd get hired or not, because I didn't have to worry about servicing my student loans right away, and I could take a little bit of a risk. And I think that's really important for people, and I don't think it really matters where you're coming from. I think it matters where you're going.
I think we have time for one more if that microphone person can reach. I feel sure there were hands that didn't get caught. Well, perhaps we have subsided into a sense of satiation. I'm just still pondering what it would be like to listen to Middlemarch done by Alvin and the Chipmunks. Really frightening, really frightening. So, in that case...
You know that George Eliot does comment on the speed of a squirrel's heart beating?
True.
So maybe there's something in that.
So I think this is our moment to say thank you to these wonderful panelists for having joined us on this occasion.